At least once a year during hunting season, I try to travel to Maine and rent an Airbnb to go hunting. I've never purchased a home since I can't afford it for a single trip per year, so renting for the weekend makes more sense for me. In addition, I am not an expert. I am continuously gaining experience. In the past, I would travel with my uncle, but in recent years, he has not been in the best of health. I've been going alone more often recently, as he's no longer able to accompany me. Final year, which was 2022 when I wrote this, was the last hunting season I participated in. In November, I booked an Airbnb close to a national park. I arrived late on a Friday since I was required to return home after work, get ready, and then embark on a road trip. When I arrived on the long private dirt road leading to the cabin-style Airbnb, it was pitch black outside and completely silent. This time of year, there are no insects or crickets left, so the nights are quite quiet and gloomy, especially if you're staying in a remote location like this one. I parked as close as possible to the cabin, and the owner directed me to look under the mat for the key. Indeed, it was present. I carried my 2 suitcases into the cabin and unpacked them onto the bed in the single bedroom. It was a pretty snug cabin, and the owner was kind enough to turn on the heat for me. November in Maine is extremely chilly. This Airbnb had cable and Wi-Fi, so I set an alarm to get an early start at dawn, which is, in my opinion, the greatest time to spot deer, and if you're lucky, moose. The following morning, I awoke at the sound of my alarm and was in the woods in less than half an hour. As this was an unfamiliar area for me, I established a position behind some fallen trees. Normally, this would be a waiting game at this point, but I heard a man calling from behind me. I experienced a mini heart attack and spun around to see a man with gray hair who appeared to be barely 50 years old. He was gently approaching me. "What the heck are you doing here?" he asked in a slow, extremely enraged tone. I responded with "Pardon me." He stated, "Here, hunting is prohibited." I was unaware of this. When I informed him of this, he responded, "I observed you from this location. You should return the way you came." This terrified me. I retorted, "What do you mean you watched me from this height?" He informed me that he sees people riding up to that cabin all the time, always out-of-towners who are here for the wrong reasons. I expressed my regret and informed him that I would be leaving. I gathered my belongings and began heading back the way I came. When I turned around to check behind me, the man was no longer visible. According to a website, I strolled back to my accommodation and then drove to a separate park that allowed hunting. I posted there and was unsuccessful during the first half of the day. I returned to the cabin at lunchtime to recoup and have lunch. When I returned to the cabin, however, I saw that the door was unlocked. I could have sworn I had already locked it. When I entered, I was almost confident that certain items had been rearranged, and the zipper on my bag was undone. I couldn't recall if it was zipped or not, but it was customary for me to have my bag zipped. I quickly inspected each room before settling in. I was far too hungry to prepare a simple lunch, so I drove to the nearest village and ordered Chinese takeout. Then I returned immediately to the cabin. I intended to return to the park at dusk. When I returned to the cabin, I immediately ate my supper and took a nap. Following my nap, I returned to the park. I spent approximately an hour walking a quarter mile very slowly, but I found nothing. My uncle always told me that finding a deer or moose may take 10 minutes or 10 days, depending on how many are present and whether you are in the right area at the appropriate time. Unfortunately, luck was not on my side today, so when it began to grow dark, I began packing up and heading back to my truck. The drive back to the cabin was brief. I prepared the pasta and meatballs I brought for dinner while the television was playing in the background. Then I reclined on the small loveseat couch while eating and watching an old black and white film. As I sat there, I recalled how the door had been unlocked and stuff appeared to have been moved, but I did not notice anything was gone. I questioned whether or not it was all in my head. I then washed my teeth and moved to the bedroom, where I began watching another film to fall asleep. I was beginning to enter a condition of half-sleep, in which the events in the film began to merge with a sort of half-awake dream I was experiencing. Thus, the clear sound of a door opening jolted me awake from my half-sleep. I observed with grogginess that the closet door in the room was now cracked open. This immediately and thoroughly woke me up. Unlocking the door and possibly relocating goods did not appear to be a coincidence. I waited a moment before rising from my bed, going to my hunting bag, and retrieving my C-75. I returned to my bedroom, switched on the light, and aimed my revolver towards the closet door. I shouted, "Exit now, or I'll shoot." I thought I was being unnecessarily cautious because a significant portion of me still didn't believe there was genuinely a person inside. But when the door opened, I was taken aback. This older man from earlier in the day exited with a crooked smile and a lost front tooth, transforming his formerly miserable appearance. He replied, "You have me." I said, "Do not move," as I reached for my cell phone to dial 911. Thankfully, there was service here. The invader was in the hands of the police. The wait for the arrival of the sheriff's deputies was terrible. During that time, the man told me that he was sick of individuals like me not respecting the parks in this area. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I wasn't amusing him. I repeatedly told him to be quiet. I don't believe he ever stole anything from me, but he was arrested for breaking and perhaps robbery when deputies arrived. The man stated the door was simply open, but I do not know if this is true, or if he picked a lock or even climbed through a window to gain access. The Airbnb host confirmed that there were no more concealed keys and that I left the door unlocked. He appeared more concerned about whether anything of his was stolen and cast blame on me, as opposed to asking me if I was okay and apologizing for the experience. Even after learning the man's identity, he maintained he had no idea who he may have been. I still don't believe I forgot to lock the door. But thank God I was on a hunting trip and had my weaponry with me to immediately eliminate the threat. I was 14 years old when the event occurred. It was my first year of deer hunting with my family, specifically with my father and cousin. My blind was 2 miles south of my father's stand, and his stand was 9 miles southwest of my camp. We drove a four-wheeler approximately 100 yards away from his stand, leaving me with a considerable distance to walk before reaching mine. In the winter, where I live in northern Michigan, it becomes dark quickly and early. It was after 4 p.m. when I started to become cold and decided to close up my tent. I was hunting with a .243 rifle that had a pink camo cover on it with a strap around it so I could hang it off my back. I secured my blind zippers and placed my trash in a pail I owned. I immediately turned my head to see whether it was a deer when I noticed a few leaves rustling while I was disposing of my garbage. Disappointed, I dismissed it as a squirrel or a bird after around 1 minute. I shut my blinds and walked to my father's house. As I took my first steps out of my blind, I noticed a newly groomed path through the leaves. It was a wide trail not suitable for tiny animals or deer. I immediately thought of a bear or wolf and began to run to my father's location. I began to panic as the night grew darker, and I was still approximately 1 mile away. I was just walking when I was halted in my tracks by one of the most frightening things I'd ever heard. The best way to describe the murder victim would be a bear-man hybrid. As I began to run, I heard the sound around 150 yards away, with boots and bulky hunting gear on my back. It was difficult to carry 20 pounds, but fear kept me going, and I did not stop. I was still running approximately 25 seconds later when I heard it again. This time, the sound was louder and nearer. At this time, it was black outside, with just the moon providing illumination. What I saw when I spun around with my headlight was the most horrific thing I've ever seen. Approximately 50 yards distant, I observed a black figure in the darkness that was illuminated by the moonlight. It was approximately 10 feet tall and slender. I immediately began running while attempting to remove my gun from my back. I had no idea where I was running, so I simply ran. I found myself on Rabbit Road, which connects my camp to the entrance of the hunting area. I traveled along the route till I reached my camp. By the time I got into sight of my cabin, I turned around again and saw it again, this time further away. I can only describe it as a tall, black, slender figure. because it was still standing. It possessed long arms and legs. As I climbed the steps to my cabin, I threw up from weariness and continued to vomit for approximately 1 minute. After falling asleep, I awoke to the sound of my father's four-wheeler pulling into the cabin's driveway. I began crying as I ran to him and hugged him. I quickly told him the narrative of what happened and how I rushed back without stopping. Initially, he didn't believe me, but as we settled inside, his expression changed as he noticed the despair in my eyes. I slept poorly that night, and for weeks thereafter, people told me it was probably a bear or that I was hallucinating, but I knew what I saw. Now that I'm older, I only hunt with a companion. I also hunt with a larger firearm because it gives me confidence that I can take down larger games. As I write this, I realize that this was the most terrifying experience of my life. Tonight's 9. I was on my way home from school on a Friday evening. I was 13 years old and quite eager to go hunting. I enjoy hunting, particularly on the ranch we visit in Alice, Texas. Since I've been going there since I was 4 years old, I have several recollections of the location. My grandfather, my father, and I traveled there. We were going to be the ranch owner's family and a few others. We were packed and prepared to depart. My favorite season was deer season. The sensation of seeing a large deer in front of your eyes is a magnificent experience, as is shooting it. People claim that it's immoral to slaughter animals, but I disagree if you're genuinely eating them. It was 10 p.m. when we arrived at the ranch, so it was quite dark outside. I believe the ranch is 300 acres in size, and the campsite is an ancient shack around the size of a standard bedroom. There is electricity, but it is not a large cabin where the majority of hunters sleep. However, there are small beds there. But when I was young, my father discovered a large snake shed in one of the mattresses, so we now sleep in a tent. The camp is surrounded by forests with a little field up front, possibly a little less than the size of a football field. This field is utilized for dove hunting. In any case, we were unloading our gear and exchanging jokes around the campfire when we heard this scream. It was the most upsetting thing I had ever heard. It sounded like a combination of humans and something else. The scream could be heard nearby. We all leaped out of our seats and glanced at one another. I could tell in their eyes that every man there was terrified. "What the hell was that?" exclaimed the ranch owner initially. He then instructed us and a member of his family to investigate. We went to investigate because he is a rather elderly man in his 70s. We utilized my grandfather's ATD to conduct a cursory perimeter check, but found nothing. I remained traumatized. I was even afraid to enter the blind alone. As all hunters are aware, we must rise before daylight and enter the blind to remain hidden by deer. I went to sleep with a gun next to me in the tent. I awoke to the alarm and prepared myself. Even though it was just an hour or two before morning, I was terrified of being left alone in the darkness. Even today, I am still terrified by the scream, which still echoes in my memory. My grandfather dropped me off at the blind before leaving on his ATV. My father was already in his role. My grandfather is not soft. He wants you to know and perform the task. Being him, he left me in the dark and expected me to find my way to the blind. So, I began ascending the ladder and navigating using only my hands. I entered the blind and awaited the sun's appearance. 20 minutes had passed, and it was still pitch black when I observed something in the trail's middle. My uncle had given me a night vision sight, and I decided it was the appropriate moment to utilize it. I was eager, anticipating a large deer, but what I saw when I peered through the scope still bothers me to this day. I don't care if you believe me or not, but I was expecting to see a deer coming toward the woods. But instead, I saw a person walking in that direction. It appeared distorted yet had the contour of a person. I don't know how it noticed me, but I saw it turn and face towards me. Now, night vision isn't particularly sharp, so I couldn't see its face, but I could tell it was staring at me. The following statement will remain with me for the rest of my life. It emitted the same blood-curdling scream as the night before, but it was louder. At that time, I cannot convey the fear I felt. The word fear falls short of describing how I felt. I managed to break free from whatever shock I was in and managed to grab my .22 and started to shoot the entire clip into the route it was standing in. Still terrified, I retrieved my firearm and blasted every cartridge into the path. When I checked the night vision again, it was gone. I was in total disbelief. I began receiving several SMS and phone calls, especially from my father. I told him what had occurred, and both he and my grandfather had heard it. I no longer travel there alone, nor do I park off the main gravel road. I never discovered the identities of the two youths or the person who punctured my tires.